Chapter 1. The White Owl. Nobody saw the owl, white in the moonlight, black against the stars. Nobody heard him as he glided over on silent wings of velvet. The owl saw and heard everything. He settled in a tree, his claws hooked on a branch, and he stared at the girl in the glade below. The wind moaned, rocking the branch, scudding low clouds across the evening sky. It lifted the hair of the girl. The owl was watching her with his round, dark eyes. The girl moved slowly from the trees toward the middle of the glade, where a pool glimmered. She was concentrating. Each deliberate step took her nearer to her purpose. Her hands were open and held slightly in front of her. The wind sighed again in the trees. It blew her cloak tightly against her slender figure and rustled her hair around her wide-eyed face. Her lips were parted. "Give me the child," Sarah said in a voice that was low but firm with the courage of her quest. She halted, her hands still held out. "Give me the child," she repeated. "Through dangers untold and hardships unnumbered, I have fought my way to the castle here beyond the Goblin City to take back the child that you have stolen." She bit her lip and continued, "For my will is as strong as yours, and my kingdom as great." She closed her eyes tightly. Thunder rumbled. The owl blinked once. "My will is as strong as yours," Sarah spoke with even more intensity now, "and my kingdom as great." She frowned, and her shoulders dropped. "Oh, damn," she muttered. Reaching under her cloak, she brought out a book. Its title was The Labyrinth. Holding the book up before her, she read aloud from it. In the fading light, it was not easy to make out the words. "You have no power over me." She got no further. Another clap of thunder, nearer this time, made her jump. It also alarmed a big, shaggy sheepdog who had not minded sitting by the pool and being admonished by Sarah, but who now decided that it was time to go home, and said so with several sharp barks. Sarah held her cloak around her. It did not give her much warmth, being no more than an old curtain cut down and fastened at the neck by a glass brooch. She ignored Merlin, the sheepdog, while concentrating on learning the speech in her book. "You have no power over me," she whispered, her eyes closed again, and repeated the phrase several times. A clock above the little pavilion in the park chimed 7 times and penetrated Sarah's concentration. She stared at Merlin. "Oh no," she said. "I don't believe it. That was 7, wasn't it?" Merlin stood up and shook himself, sensing that some more interesting action was due. Sarah turned and ran. Merlin followed. The thunderclouds splattered them both with large drops of rain. The owl had watched it all. When Sarah and Merlin left the park, he sat still on his branch, in no hurry to follow them. This was his time of day. He knew what he wanted. An owl is born with all his questions answered. All the way down the street, which was lined on both sides with privet-hedged Victorian houses similar to her own, Sarah was muttering to herself, "It's not fair. It's not fair." The mutter had turned to a gasp by the time she came within sight of her home. Merlin, having bounded along with her on his shaggy paws, was wheezing too. His mistress, who normally moved at a gentle, dreamy pace, had this odd habit of liking to sprint home from the park in the evening. Perhaps that owl had something to do with it. Merlin was not sure. He didn't like the owl. He knew that. "It's not fair." Sarah was close to sobbing. The world at large was not fair, hardly ever, but in particular her stepmother was ruthlessly not fair to her. There she stood now, in the front doorway of the house, all dressed up in that frightful dark blue evening gown of hers. The fur coat left open to reveal the low cut of the neckline, the awful necklace vulgarly winking above her freckled breast, and wouldn't you know, she was looking at her watch. Not just looking at it, but staring at it, to make good and sure that Sarah would feel guilty before she was accused again. As Sarah came to a halt on the path in the front garden, she could hear her baby brother Toby bawling inside the house. He was her half-brother, really, but she did not call him that, not since her school friend Alice had asked, "What's the other half of him, then?" And Sarah had been unable to think of an answer. "Half nothing to do with me." That was no good. It wasn't true either. Sometimes she felt fiercely protective of Toby, wanted to dress him up and carry him in her arms and take him away from all this, to a better place, a fairer world, an island somewhere perhaps. At other times, and this was one, she hated Toby, who had twice as many parents in attendance on him as she had. When she hated Toby, it frightened her, because it led her into thinking about how she could hurt him. There must be something wrong with me, she would reflect, that I would even think of hurting someone I dote upon. Or is it that there is something wrong in doting upon someone I hate? She wished she had a friend who would understand the dilemma, and maybe explain it to her, but there was no one. Her friends at school would think her a witch if she even mentioned the idea of hurting Toby, and as for her father, it would frighten him even more than it frightened Sarah herself. So she kept the perplexity well hidden. Sarah stood before her stepmother and deliberately held her head high. "I'm sorry," she said in a bored voice to show that she wasn't sorry at all, and anyway it was unnecessary to make a thing out of it. "Well," her stepmother told her, "don't stand out there in the rain. Come on." She stood aside to make room for Sarah to pass her in the doorway, and she glanced again at her wristwatch. Sarah made a point of never touching her stepmother, not even brushing against her clothes. She edged inside, close to the doorframe. Merlin started to follow her. "Not the dog," her stepmother said. "But it's pouring." Her stepmother wagged a finger at Merlin twice. "In the garage, you," she commanded. "Go on." Merlin dropped his head and loped around the side of the house. Sarah watched him go and bit her lip. Why, she wondered for the trillionth time, does my stepmother always have to put on this performance when they go out in the evening? It was so hammy. That was one of Sarah's favorite words, since she had heard her mother's co-star Jeremy use it to put down another actor in the play they were doing. Such a rag bag of over-the-top cliches. She remembered how Jeremy had sounded French when he said cliches, thrilling her with his sophistication. Why couldn't her stepmother find a new way into the part? Oh, she loved the way in which Jeremy talked about other actors. She was determined to become an actress herself so that she could talk like that all the time. Her father seldom talked at all about people at his office, and when he did, it was dreary in comparison. Her stepmother closed the front door, looked at her watch once more, took a deep breath, and started one of her cliched speeches. "Sarah, you're an hour late." Sarah opened her mouth, but her stepmother cut her off with a little humorless smile. "Let me finish, Sarah. Your father and I go out very rarely." "You go out every weekend," Sarah interrupted rapidly. Her stepmother ignored that. "And I ask you to babysit only if it won't interfere with your plans." "How would you know?" Sarah had half turned away so as not to flatter her stepmother with her attention, and was busy with putting her book on the hall stand, unclipping her brooch, and folding the cloak over her arm. "You don't know what my plans are. You don't ask me." She glanced at her own face in the mirror of the hall stand, checking that her expression was cool and poised, not over the top. She liked the clothes she was wearing, a cream-colored shirt with full sleeves, a brocaded waistcoat loosely over the shirt, blue jeans, and a leather belt. She turned even farther away from her stepmother to check on how her shirt hung from her breasts down to her waist. She tucked it in a little at the belt to make it tighter. Her stepmother was watching her coldly. "I am assuming you would tell me if you had a date." "I would like it if you had a date. A 15-year-old girl should have dates." "Well," Sarah was thinking, "if I have a date, you are the last person I would tell." What a hammy, no, tacky view of life you do have. She smiled grimly to herself. "Perhaps I will have a date," she thought. "Perhaps I will, but you will not like it, not one bit, when you see who's dating me. I doubt you will see him. All you will know about is hearing the front door shut behind me, and you will sneak to the window, as you always do, and poke your nose between those horrid, phony lace curtains you put up there, and you will see the tailgates of a wicked dove-gray limousine vanishing around the corner. And after that, you will keep seeing pictures in the magazines of the two of us together in Bermuda, in Saint-Tropez, and Benares, and there will be nothing at all you can possibly do about it, for all your firm views on bedtimes and developmental psychology, and my duties in rolling up the toothpaste tube from the bottom. Oh, stepmother, are you going to be sorry when you read in Vogue about the cosmic cash that Hollywood producers are offering us for... Sarah's father came down the stairs into the hall. In his arms he was carrying Toby, clad in red and white striped pajamas. He patted the baby's back. "Oh, Sarah," he said mildly, "you're here at last. We were worried about you." "Oh, leave me alone." Afraid that she might be close to tears, Sarah gave them no chance to reason with her. She ran upstairs. They were always so reasonable, particularly her father, so long-suffering and mild with her, so utterly convinced that they were always obviously in the right, and that it was only a matter of time before she consented to do as they wished. Why did her father always take that woman's side? Her mother never wore that look of pained tolerance. She was a woman who could shout and laugh and hug you and slap you all within a minute or two. When she and Sarah had a quarrel, it was an explosion. 5 minutes later, it was forgotten. In the hallway, her stepmother had sat down, still in her fur coat. Wearily, she was saying, "I don't know what to do anymore. She treats me like a wicked stepmother in a fairy story, no matter what I say. I have tried, Robert." "Well," Sarah's father patted Toby thoughtfully, "it is hard to have your mother walk out on you at that age. At any age, I suppose." "That's what you always say, and of course you're right. But will she never change?" Holding Toby in one arm, Robert patted his wife on the shoulder. "I'll go and talk to her." Thunder rumbled again. A squall of raindrops clattered on the windows. Sarah was in her room. It was the only safe place in the world. She made a point of going all around it each day, checking that everything was just where it had been and should be. Although her stepmother seldom came in there, except to deliver some ironed clothes, or to give Sarah a message, she was not to be trusted. It would be typical of her to take it into her head to dust the room, even though Sarah made sure that it was kept clean, and then she would be bound to move things around and not put them back where they belonged. It was essential to ward off that disturbing spirit. All the books had to remain in their proper positions, in alphabetical order by author and, within each author's group, in order of acquisition. Other shelves were filled with toys and dolls, and they were positioned according to affinities known only to Sarah. The curtains had to hang exactly so that, when Sarah was lying in her bed, they symmetrically framed the second poplar tree in a line that she could see from the window. The wastepaper basket stood so that its base just touched the edge of one particular block on the parquet floor. It would be unsafe if these things were not so. Let disorder set in, and the room would never be familiar again. People talked about how upsetting it was to be burgled, and Sarah knew just how it must feel, as though some uncaring stranger were fooling around with your most precious soul. The woman who came in to clean 3 times a week knew that she was never to do anything to this room. Sarah looked after everything in there herself. She had learned how to fix electric plugs and tighten screws and hang pictures so that her father should have no need to come in except to speak to her. Sarah was now standing in the middle of her room. Her eyes were red. She sniffled and chewed her lower lip. Then she walked over to her dressing table and gazed at a framed photograph. Her father and mother and herself, age 10, gazed back at her. Her parents' smiles were confident. Her own face in the photograph was, she thought, slightly over the top, grinning too keenly. All around the room, other eyes watched. Photographs and posters displayed her mother in various costumes for various parts. Clippings from Variety were taped to the mirror of the dressing table, praising her mother's performances or announcing others she would give. On the wall beside the bed was pinned a poster advertising her latest play. In the picture, Sarah's mother and her co-star Jeremy were cheek to cheek, their arms around each other, smiling confidently. The photographer had lit the pair beautifully, showing her to be so pretty and he so handsome, with his blonde hair and a golden chain around his neck. Beneath the picture was a quote from one of the theater critics. "I have seldom felt such warmth irradiating an audience." The poster was signed with large, flourishing signatures. "For darling Sarah, with all my love, Mom." And in a different hand, "All good wishes, Sarah, Jeremy." Near the posters were more press clippings from different newspapers, arranged in chronological order. In them, the 2 stars could be seen dining together in restaurants, drinking together at parties and laughing together in a little rowboat. The texts were all on the theme of romancing on and off the stage. Still sniffing from time to time, Sarah went to the small table beside her bed and picked up the music box her mother had given her for her 15th birthday. The memory of that gorgeous day was still vivid. A taxi had been sent for her in the morning, but instead of going to her mother's place, it had taken her along the waterfront to where Jeremy and her mother were waiting in Jeremy's old black Mercedes. They went out into the country for lunch beside a swimming pool at some club where Jeremy was a member, and the waiters spoke French. And later, in the pool, Jeremy had clowned around, pretending to drown, to such effect that an elderly man had rung the alarm bell. They had giggled in the car all the way back to town. At her mother's place, Sarah was given Jeremy's present, an evening gown in pale blue. She wore it to go with them to a new musical that evening, and afterward to supper in a dimly lit restaurant. Jeremy was wickedly funny about every member of the cast they had seen in the musical. Sarah's mother had pretended to disapprove of his scandalous gossip, but that had only made Sarah and Jeremy laugh more uncontrollably, and soon all three of them had tears in their eyes. Jeremy had danced with Sarah, smiling down at her. He kidded her that a flashbulb meant that they'd be all over the gossip columns next morning, and all the way home he drove fast to shake off the photographers he claimed, grinning. As they said good night, her mother gave Sarah a little parcel wrapped in silver paper and tied with a pale blue bow. Back in her room, Sarah had unwrapped it and found the music box. The tune of Greensleeves tinkled, and a little dancer in a frilly pink dress twirled pirouettes. Sarah watched it reverently until it became slow and jerky in motion. Then she put it down and quietly recited from a poem she had studied in her English class. O body swayed to music, O brightening glance, how can we know the dancer from the dance? It was so easy to learn poetry by heart. She never had any difficulty in remembering those lines whenever she opened her music box. In fact, she reflected, it's easier to remember them than to forget them. So why was she having such trouble in learning the speech from the Labyrinth? It was only a game she was playing. No one was waiting for her to rehearse it. No audience except Merlin would judge her performance of it. It should have been a piece of cake. She frowned. How could she ever hope to get on stage if she could not remember one speech? She tried again. Through dangers untold and hardships unnumbered, I have fought my way here to the castle beyond the goblin city to take back the child you have stolen. She paused, her eyes on the poster of her mother in Jeremy's arms, and decided it would help her performance if she prepared for it. If you're going to get into a part, her mother had told her, you've got to have the right prop. Costume and makeup and wigs, they were more for the actor's benefit than for the audience's. They helped you escape from your own life and find a way into the part, as Jeremy said. And after each show, you take it all off, and you've wiped the slate clean. Every day is a fresh start. You could invent yourself again and again. Sarah took a lipstick from the drawer in her dressing table, put a little on her lips, and rolled them together as her mother did. Her face close to the mirror, she applied a little more to the corners of her mouth. There was a tapping on her door, and her father's voice came from outside. Sarah, can I talk to you? Still looking in the mirror, she replied, There's nothing to talk about. She waited. He would not come in unless she invited him. She imagined him standing there, frowning, rubbing his forehead, trying to think what he ought to say next. Something firm enough to please that woman, but amicable enough to reassure his daughter. You better hurry, Sarah said, if you want to make the show. Toby's had his supper, her father's voice said, and he's in bed now. If you could just make sure he goes to sleep all right, we'll be back around midnight. Again a pause. Then the sound of footsteps walking away, with a slowness measured to express a blend of concern and resignation. He had done all that could be expected of him. Sarah turned from the mirror and stared accusingly at the closed door. You really wanted to talk to me, didn't you? She murmured. Practically broke down the door. Once upon a time, he would not have gone out without giving her a kiss. She sniffled. Things had certainly changed in this house. She put the lipstick in her pocket and wiped her lips with a tissue. As she went to throw it in the waste paper basket, something caught her eye. More exactly, something that was not there caught her eye. Lancelot was not there. Rapidly, she rummaged through her shelf of toys and dolls and cuddly things, dogs and monkeys and soldiers and clowns, though she knew it would be fruitless. If the teddy bear were there at all, he would have been in his appointed place. He was gone. The order of the room had been violated. Sarah's cheeks were hot. "Someone's been in my room," she thought. "I hate her." Outside, the taxi was pulling away. Sarah heard it and ran to the window. "I hate you," she screamed. No one heard her save Merlin, and he could do no more than he was doing already, which was to bark loudly in the garage. She knew where she would find Lancelot. Toby already had everything that his baby heart could desire, had so much more than Sarah had ever had, yet more was given to him every day without question. She stormed into the nursery. The teddy bear was spread-eagled on the carpet, just tossed away like that. Sarah picked Lancelot up and clutched him to her. Toby, full of warm milk, had been almost asleep in his crib. Sarah's entrance aroused him. She glared at the baby. "I hate her. I hate you." Toby started to cry. Sarah shuddered and held Lancelot still more tightly. "Oh," she wailed, "someone save me. Take me away from this awful place." Toby was howling now. His face was red. Sarah was wailing. Merlin was barking outside. The storm delivered a lightning flash and clap of thunder directly above the house. It rattled the windows in their frames. Teacups danced in the kitchen cupboard. "Someone save me," Sarah begged. "Listen," said a goblin, one eye opened. All around him, on top of him, beneath him, the nest of goblins stirred sleepily. Another eye opened, and another, all crazed eyes, red and staring. Some of the goblins had horns, and some had pointed teeth. Some had fingers like claws. Some were dressed in scraps of armor, a helmet, a gorget, but all of them had scaly feet, and all had baleful eyes. Higgledy-piggledy in a heap they slept in their dirty chamber at the castle of the Goblin King. Their eyes went on opening, and their ears pricked up. "All right, hush now, shush." Sarah was trying to calm herself down as much as her baby brother. "What do you want, Do you want a story? All right." With barely a moment's thought, she picked up the thread of the labyrinth. Once upon a time there was a beautiful young woman whose stepmother always made her stay with the baby. The baby was a spoiled child who wanted everything for himself, and the young woman was practically a slave girl. But what no one knew was this: the king of the goblins had fallen in love with her and given her certain powers. In the castle, the goblins' eyes opened very wide. They were all at attention. The lightning and thunder crashed again, but both Sarah and Toby had become quieter. One night, Sarah continued, when the baby had been particularly nasty, the girl called on the goblins to help her, and they said to her, "Say your right words, and we'll take the baby away to the goblin city, and then you'll be free." Those were their words to her. The goblins nodded enthusiastically. Toby was nearly asleep again, with only a light protest remaining on his breath. Sarah, enjoying her own invention, leaned closer to him, over the side of the crib. She was holding her audience in her spell. Lancelot was in her arms. But the girl knew, she went on, that the king of the goblins would keep the baby in his castle for ever and ever and ever, and he would turn the baby into a goblin. And so she suffered in silence through many a long month, until one night, worn out by a day of slaving and housework, and hurt beyond measure by the harsh, ungrateful words of her stepmother, she could bear it no longer. By now, Sarah was leaning so close to Toby that she was whispering into his pink little ear. Suddenly, he turned over in his crib and stared into her eyes, only a couple of inches away. There was a moment of silence. Then Toby opened his mouth and began to howl loudly and insistently. "Oh!" Sarah snorted in disgust, standing up straight again. The thunder rolled, and Merlin gave it all he had. Sarah sighed, frowned, shrugged, and decided there was no way around it. She picked Toby up and walked around the room, jogging him in her arms together with Lancelot. The small bedside light threw their shadows on the wall, huge and flickering. "All right," she said. "All right, come on now. Rockabye baby and all that stuff. Come on, Toby. Knock it off." Toby wasn't going to knock it off just for being jogged. He felt they had a serious grievance to express. "Toby," his sister said sternly, "be quiet, will you? Please? Or—" Her voice lowered. I'll say the words." She looked up quickly at the shadows on the wall and addressed them theatrically. No, I mustn't. I mustn't say. I wish. "Listen," said the goblin again. Every glowing eye in the nest, every ear was open now. A second goblin spoke. "She's going to say it." "Say what?" asked a stupid goblin. "Shush." The first goblin was straining to hear Sarah. "You shut up," said the stupid goblin. In the hubbub, the first goblin thought he would go crazy with trying to hear. "Shush, shush." He put his hand over the mouth of the stupid goblin. The second goblin shrieked, "Quiet!" and thumped those nearest to him. "Listen," the first goblin admonished the rest. "She's going to say the words." The rest of them managed to silence themselves. They listened intently to Sarah. She was standing erect. Toby had reached such a crescendo of screaming, red in the face, that he could scarcely draw breath. His body was straining against Sarah's arms with the effort he was making. Lancelot had fallen to the floor again. Sarah closed her eyes and quivered. "I can bear it no longer," she exclaimed, and held the howling baby above her head, like a sacrificial offering. She started to intone, Goblin King, wherever you may be, come and take this child of mine far away from me." Lightning cracked. Thunder crashed. The goblins dropped their head, crestfallen. "That's not right," the first goblin said witheringly. "Where did she learn that rubbish?" The second scoffed. "It doesn't even start with I wish." "Shh," said a third goblin, seizing his chance to boss the others. Sarah was still holding Toby above her head. Outraged by that, Toby was screaming even more loudly than before, which Sarah would have not thought possible. She brought him down and cuddled him, which had the effect of restoring him to his standard level of screaming. Exhausted by now, Sarah told him, "Oh, Toby, stop it. You little monster. Why should I have to put up with this? You're not my responsibility. I ought to be free, to enjoy myself. Stop it. Oh, I wish. Anything would be preferable to this cauldron of noise, anger, guilt, and weariness in which she found herself. With a little tired sob, she said, "I wish I did know what words to say to get the goblins to take you away." "So where's the problem?" the first goblin said with an impatient sigh. Pedantically, he spelled it out. "I wish the goblins would come and take you away right now. That's not that hard, is it?" In the nursery, Sarah was saying, I wish. The goblins were all alert again, biting their lips with the tension. "Did she say it?" the stupid goblin asked brightly. As one, the rest turned on him. "Shut up," they said irritably. Toby's tornado had blown itself out. He was breathing deeply with a whimper at the end of his breath. His eyes were closed. Sarah put him back in his crib, not too gently, and tucked him in. She walked quietly to the door and was shutting it behind her when he uttered an eerie shriek and started to scream again. He was hoarse now and louder in consequence. Sarah froze with her hand on the handle of the door. She moaned helplessly. "I wish the goblins would come and take you away." She paused. The goblins were so still you could have heard a snail blink. "Right now," Sarah said. In the goblin's nest there was an exhalation of pleasure. "She said it!" In a trice, all the goblins had vanished in different directions, save only the stupid goblin. He squatted there, a grin dawning on his face, until he realized that the rest had left him. "Hey," he said, "wait for me." And he tried to run in several directions at once. Then he, too, vanished. Lightning flashed, and thunder hammered the air. Toby gave out with a high-pitched screech, and Merlin barked as if all the burglars in the world were closing in. Chapter 2. What's said is said. The storm raged on over Sarah's house. The clouds boiled. Rain lashed the leaves on the trees. Thunder was followed by lightning. Sarah was listening. What she was listening to was an unnatural silence within the room. Toby had stopped crying so suddenly it scared her. She looked back inside the nursery. The bedside light was out. "Toby," she called. He did not respond. She flicked the light switch beside the door. Nothing happened. She jiggled it up and down several times to no effect. A board creaked. "Toby, are you all right? Why aren't you crying?" She stepped nervously into the quiet room. The light from the landing, coming through the doorway, threw unfamiliar shadows onto the walls and across the carpet. In the lull between two thunderclaps, she thought she heard a humming in the air. She could detect no movement at all in the crib. "Toby," she whispered in anxiety, and walked toward the crib with her breath drawn. Her hands were shaking like aspen leaves. She reached out to pull the sheet back. She recoiled. The sheet was convulsing. Weird shapes were thrusting and bulging beneath it. She thought she glimpsed things poking out from the edge of the sheet, things that were no part of Toby. She felt her heart thumping, and she put her hand over her mouth to stop herself from screaming. Then the sheet was still again. It sank slowly down over the mattress. Nothing moved. She could not turn and run away and leave him. She had to know. Whatever the horror of it, she had to know. Impulsively, she reached out her hand and pulled the sheet back. The crib was empty. For a moment, or an hour, she would never know how long, she stared at the empty crib. She was not even frightened. Her mind had been wiped clean. And then she was frightened by a soft, rapid thumping on the window pane. Her eyes clenched so tightly her fingernails scored her skin. A white owl was flapping insistently on the glass. She could see the light from the landing reflected in its great, round, dark eyes, watching her. The whiteness of its plumage was illuminated by a series of lightning flashes that seemed continuous. Behind her, a goblin briefly raised his head and ducked down again. Another did likewise. She didn't see them. Her eyes were fixed on the owl's eyes. Lightning crackled and flashed again, and this time it distracted her attention from the window by shining on the clock that stood on the mantelpiece. She saw that the hands were at 13 o'clock. She was staring distractedly at the clock when she felt something nudge the back of her legs. She glanced down. The crib was moving across the carpet on scaly legs like a lizard's with talons for toes. One leg at each corner of the crib. Sarah's lips parted, but she made no sound. Behind her, something snickered. She spun around and saw it duck down again behind the chest of drawers. Shadows were scuttling across the walls. Goblins were prancing and bobbing behind her. Sarah was watching the chest of drawers. Like the crib, it had a scaly, clawed foot at each corner, and it was dancing. She wheeled around, mouth open, hands clenched, and saw the goblins cavorting. They ducked away into the shadows to evade her eyes. She looked for something that would serve as a weapon. In the corner of the nursery was an old broom. She took it and advanced upon the goblins. "Go away! Go away!" she whimpered, trying to sweep them up, but the handle of the broom twisted in her hands and slithered out of her grasp. The storm wind rose to a pitch. Lightning made daylight in the room, and scared faces suddenly began to vanish into cupboards, drawers, or down the cracks between floorboards. As the thunder boomed and the wind shook the curtains, a blast of air blew the window open. Between the fluttering curtains, the white owl entered. Sarah wrapped her arms around her face and screamed again. She was petrified that the flapping owl would brush across her. She thought she would die if it did. She felt the wind blowing her hair around, but the flapping had ceased. Between her fingers she peeked out to see where the bird was perched. Perhaps it had flown out again. A prolonged crackling of lightning was throwing a giant shadow on the wall facing the window. It was the shadow of a human figure. Sarah spun around. Silhouetted against the stormy sky was a man. He wore a cloak which swirled in the wind. She could see that his hair was shoulder-length and blonde. Something glinted about his neck. More than that, she could not see in the dim light. She said, and cleared her throat. "Who are you?" "Don't you know?" The man's voice was calm, almost kindly. Lightning traced the veins of the sky and lit up his face. He was not smiling, as one might smile on greeting a stranger, nor was his expression fierce. His eyes were fixed upon Sarah's with an intensity she found compelling. When he took a step toward her, into the light shining from the doorway, she did not retreat. If his eyes had not hypnotized her, the golden chain around his neck might have. A sickle-shaped ornament hung from it upon his chest. His shirt was cream-colored, open at the front, loose-sleeved with silken cuffs at the wrist. Over it he wore a tight black waistcoat. He was shod in black boots over gray tights, and on his hands were black gloves. In one of them he held the jeweled knob of a curious cane with a fishtail shape at the end. Sarah answered. The humming that she had thought she heard in the air was now quite distinct and musical. The stranger smiled at her hesitancy. He was certainly handsome. She had not expected that. When she spoke, her voice was a whisper. You're him, aren't you? You're the king of goblins. He bowed. Jareth. She resisted the ridiculous impulse to return the curtsy. I have saved you, he said. I have liberated you from those bonds that distress you and frighten you. You're free now, Sarah. Oh, no. I don't want to be free, she answered. I mean, I do, but I want my little brother back, please. She gave him a tiny smile. If it's all the same to you. Jareth folded his hands on top of his cane. What's said is said. But I didn't mean it, Sarah replied quickly. Didn't you now? Oh, please, where is he? Jareth chuckled. You know very well where he is. Please bring him back. Please. She heard herself speaking in a small voice. Please. Sarah. Jareth frowned and shook his head. His expression was all concern for her. Go back to your room, read your books, put on your costume. That is your real life. Forget about the baby. No, I can't. For a moment, they regarded each other, adversaries trying to size each other up on the outset of a long contest. Thunder rumbled. Then Jareth raised his left arm and made a large gesture with his hand. Sarah looked around, thinking that he was summoning assistance. When she faced him again, a glowing crystal had appeared in his hand. I've brought you a gift, he said, holding it out to her. She paused. She could not trust him. What is it? It's a crystal, nothing more. Except if you turn it this way, it will show you your dreams. Sarah's lips parted involuntarily. With a teasing smile, Jareth watched her face, while he spun the shining crystal around in his fingers. Her hand started to reach out for it. He smiled a little more and withdrew the crystal from her. Raising the cane with his other hand, he told her, But this is not a gift for an ordinary girl who takes care of a screaming baby. His voice was quieter now, and huskier. Do you want it, Sarah? He held it out toward her again. This time, her hands remained by her sides, and she made no answer. Her eyes were fixed on the dancing, flashing glints in the crystal. To see her own dreams. What wouldn't she give for that? Then forget the baby, Jareth said firmly. While Sarah hesitated, another bolt of thunder and lightning illuminated the sky behind the Goblin King. She was torn. The gift was not only seductive, it was also the choice of someone who understood her, someone who cared about the secret places of her imagination and knew how infinitely much more they meant to her than anything else. In return, she would have to trade her responsibility for an offensively spoiled child who made endless demands upon her and never showed the least sign of gratitude, who was, after all, only her half-brother. The crystal was spinning, glowing. She willed her eyes to close. From behind shut eyelids, she heard a voice answering. It was her own voice, but it seemed to be a memory. I can't. It isn't that I don't appreciate what you're trying to do for me, but I want my baby brother back. He must be so scared. She opened her eyes again. Jareth snorted and tossed his mane of blonde hair. He had lost patience with the girl. With a wave of his hand, he extinguished the crystal. With another wave, he plucked a live snake from the air. He held it with a straight arm in front of him so that it writhed and hissed near Sarah's face. Then he threw it at her. "Don't defy me," he warned her. It was wrapped around her neck. She clutched desperately at the thing and found that it was now a silk scarf. She pulled it off, looked at it, and the snake came leaping out of the scarf. She yelled, dropped it, and jumped away. When it hit the floor, it shattered into a number of horribly ugly little goblins, who scuttled, snickering, to the corners of the room. Other goblins crept from the shadows, or popped out from their hiding places and stood all around the room, brazen now, watching to see what their king would do to her next. "You're no match for me, Sarah," Jareth sounded impatient. "Let the child alone. Take my gift. I will not offer it to you again." Before he could produce the crystal, Sarah told him, "No." She paused. "Thank you all the same, but I can't do what you want. Can't you see that? I must have my brother back. You will never find him." "Ah," Sarah said, and took a deep breath. "Then there is a place to look." Just for a moment, Jareth's face flinched. Sarah saw it, the merest trace of fear fleeting across his eyes. Was it possible? His nostrils tightened. He gripped his cane, and appeared to hesitate slightly before answering her. She could not quite believe it, but the suspicion that the Goblin King could be afraid of her, even if only momentarily, was encouraging. "Yes," he said, "there is a place." And now, in a really hammy gesture straight out of vaudeville, he twirled his hand and pointed through the window. There. Lightning and thunder, right on cue, she thought. She moved past him and stared into the night. On a distant hill, brilliant in the flashes, she saw a castle. She leaned on the windowsill, trying to see more clearly. There were towers with turrets, massive walls, spires and domes, a portcullis, and a bridge. The whole edifice was built on top of a sharply rising mound. Around it, the lightning flickered and forked like snakes' tongues. Beyond was blackness. From just behind her, Jareth murmured, "Do you still want to look for him?" "Yes," she swallowed. "Is that—" She remembered the words. "The castle beyond the Goblin City?" Jareth did not answer at once, and she turned around. He was still there, watching her intensely, but they were no longer in the house. They stood facing each other on a windswept hilltop. Between them and the hill on which the castle stood was a broad valley. In the darkness, she could not tell what was down there. She turned again. The wind blew her hair over her face, brushing it back. She took one timid step forward. Jareth's voice came from behind her. "Turn back, Sarah. Turn back before it's too late." "I can't. I can't. Don't you understand that?" She shook her head slowly, gazing at the distant castle, and to herself quietly repeated, "I can't." "What a pity." Jareth's voice was low and gentle, as though he really meant it. She was looking at the castle. It seemed to be a long way off, but not impossibly far to travel. It depended on what she would encounter in the valley, how easily it could be crossed. Was the darkness down there perpetual? "It doesn't look that far," she said, and heard in her voice the effort she was making to sound brave. Jareth was at her elbow now. He looked at her with a smile that was icy. "It's farther than you think." Pointing at a tree, he added, "And time is short." Sarah saw an antique wooden clock had appeared on the tree, as though growing from a branch. On it were marked the hours to 13, as on the nursery clock in the lightning. "You have 13 hours to unriddle the labyrinth," Jareth told her, "before your baby brother becomes one of us." "Us?" Jareth nodded. "Forever." Magic still hummed in the air. Sarah was standing still, hair tossing in the wind, looking out across the valley toward the castle. After a while she said, "Tell me where I start." She waited for an answer, and finally she heard him say, "A pity." "What?" She turned her head to look up at him, but he was not there. She spun all around. He had vanished. She was alone in the night, on a windswept hilltop. She looked across again at the castle. The storm was passing away. Blades of clouds sliced across the moon. She thought she glimpsed the figure of an owl, high above, wings spread wide on the air as he flew steadily away from her. She took another step forward, down the hillside, but there was no ground beneath her feet. She began to fall.